Greetings. Hello. Welcome to PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series. My name is Caitlin Monroe-Seiler, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Today, Dr. Susan Lingle will be speaking about coyote diet and feeding behavior on Canada's grasslands. Before we begin, I'd like to state that we respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. For a millennia, they have worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain. I'd like to thank our original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. Just a few items before we get going. I'd like to note that PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series is a monthly presentation about anything to do with prairie conservation or species at risk. And on March 27th, Dr. Paul Jones with the Alberta Conservation Association will be speaking about pronghorn. And Dr. Jones has won awards for his work, and I highly recommend catching that one. You can register through the PCAP website. A reminder to all of our listeners out there, we have over 500 registrants for today's webinar, which is awesome. So with that, you'll be muted for the duration of the webinar. But if you have any questions, just type it into the Q&A section of the webinar dashboard at any time during the presentation. And feel free to upvote other people's questions if you have the same. It makes my job moderating a little bit easier. I'd like to take a moment to note that financial support for today's webinar is provided by our presenting sponsors, Canadian Forage and Grasslands Association, North American Helium, Nutrien, Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association, and SaskTel. In-kind support has been provided by the University of Winnipeg. So without further ado, today's presenter, Dr. Susan Lingle, holds a Master's of Science degree in Environmental Science from the University of Calgary, a PhD in Zoology from Cambridge University in the UK, and has been a faculty member at the University of Winnipeg since 2008. Dr. Lingle and her students have conducted research into the behavior and ecology of prey, white-tailed deer, mule deer, and ground squirrels, and their predators, coyotes, at the McIntyre Ranch in southern Alberta since 1993, and more recently extended this research to predators and prey in southwest Saskatchewan. Dr. Lingle quickly grew to appreciate the biodiversity of the prairie and the essential role that ranchers and ranching have in conserving Canada's grasslands after starting to conduct research at the McIntyre Ranch. So with that, I'll pass it over.
Thank you, Caitlin. Thank you so much for inviting me to give this presentation. And I very much appreciate so many people attending the webinar. I wish I could see some of you. And if I glance to the left, I can see Caitlin there, and that's on my laptop screen. So if you're wondering why I occasionally glance to the left, that probably explains it. Before we begin, let's see. Great, there. Thanks for acknowledging the Indigenous peoples living on the land and caretaking for the land. I just want to add to that by acknowledging the individuals who have lived and cared for the land and continue to care for the land in the regions where this work takes place, including on Treaty 7 land in Alberta, Treaty 4 land in southwest Saskatchewan, and Treaty 1 territory within Manitoba. All right, so yeah, I ended up in McIntyre Ranch in late 1993. There's so many people to acknowledge, only a few who are on the slides. For now, I'd like to send a special thanks to the Thrall family and the McIntyre Ranching staff for hosting my work there all these years. It's been a real privilege. And for the more recent work, I want to thank many members of the ranching community around Val-Marie for enabling my master's student, Shayla Jackson, and her field assistants to work on their land. And in particular, Lynn and Sherry Grant and Greg Hornfeld, where she was able to conduct observations of coyotes hunting, or of coyote behavior on their land. Right. So during my first visit to the McIntyre, I saw white-tailed deer, mule deer, of course, pronghorn, coyotes, and other animals casually wandering over the prairie. After spending only a few days on the ranch, I started to feel as though I was getting a glimpse at what the prairie grasslands must have looked like a few hundred years ago. Now, although I grew up in areas with forest, I quickly learned to appreciate the prairie, and not only for the unparalleled opportunities to observe the behavior of animals, which is why I went there in the first place. Instead, I learned about the tremendous biodiversity found on the prairie and the fact that the temperate grasslands of the world have the largest proportion of animals and plants that have gone extinct or are currently listed at being at risk of going extinct. By working at the McIntyre Ranch, I learned that much of the remaining grasslands, native grasslands, are currently used for ranching. Now, this means that ranchers are the primary stewards of these grasslands. And very many ranchers take this role very seriously. And we see amazing initiatives such as the rancher-led South of the Divide Conservation Action Program, or SODCAP. This has certainly been the case at the McIntyre Ranch since it was first established by Billy McIntyre, which was in 1894. Billy McIntyre emphasized the importance of maintaining the grass in good condition and using the wildlife as a bit of a barometer to see that it was in good condition for his cattle. I think Ralph Thaw put Billy McIntyre's thoughts into words when he said, "This isn't about the cattle, it's about grass management, about a sustainable and long-term vision for the ranch." The Thrall's family's views have given rise to the establishment of a conservation easement in collaboration with Nature Conservancy of Canada and Ducks Unlimited, as was announced this summer. So today I will be examining some topics related to coyote and cattle interactions. And these are important ecologically, and I hope they will also interest and be of value to any ranchers that may be present. So briefly, I will give an overview of some of the long-term monitoring we've been doing at the McIntyre, followed by work on coyote diet, both in around 2007 and then more recently, and also some observations done by Shayla Jackson the previous summer to this summer, where she's watching coyotes interacting with native prey, but also with cattle. So the reason I went to the McIntyre in the first place was that I was looking for a place to observe, to learn about the anti-predator behavior of white-tailed mule deer. Now, many biologists will sort of pretend they're the predator and measure things like detection distance, but I had only been at the McIntyre about 2 weeks, and I had observed a few attempted predation attempts by coyotes on deer and an actual predation illustrated at Wright. That was way back in 1994. And so it turns out, that at the ranch with the open scenery, you have the opportunity to watch these hunts. And it turns out the coyotes will form packs. They typically averaged about 4 coyotes per pack that would go on hunts of deer throughout the year, both summer and winter. This was novel at the time because coyotes were more viewed as a predator of small prey. But given the unparalleled views that are possible in a native grassland, such as the McIntyre Ranch or around Val-Marie, we were able to sit at certain vantage points with spotting scopes and binoculars and observe the coyotes as they went on these hunts. We were able to use these data to figure out the conditions that would make a deer sort of vulnerable to predation or that would help it avoid predation. So by conditions, it could be the deer's behavior, the way it used the habitat. So a very basic difference between white-tailed deer and mule deer, and I won't be talking about deer very much today, even though that's my sort of specialty, is that white-tailed deer will basically run away from coyotes. They either hide or individuals flee from coyotes. Mule deer, on the other hand, will bunch together And as long as they do that, coyotes will usually stop at that point. If it escalates at all, for example, a fawn splits from the group, the mule deer will have a very social, aggressive defense. Now, these basic differences in behavior affect many other aspects of their lifestyles, from their social behavior, their courtship, even their habitat use, and as I'll show you a bit later, even their survival. So this differences in between these species led to a variety of work in my lab on a range of topics over the years, from maternal care to more coyote deer studies to animal communication. These are listing some of the students who've been involved. And more recently, studies into whether differences in deer behavior explain why chronic wasting disease is more common in mule deer than in white-tailed deer, and in males than in females. But let's get back to the topic for today. In addition to watching coyotes hunt deer, we've been doing long-term monitoring of the deer and coyote populations since 1994. This is from a combination of catching fawns that were tagged, and then we were able to monitor them with spotting scopes or with radio telemetry, and also doing periodic censuses. So we're able to get an index of fawn survival at the end of every summer and the end of every winter. So one thing we discovered right away, and it's been sort of confirmed again and again all these years, is that coyotes are much more likely to capture whitetails in summer and mule deer in winter. And this chart lumps together data for several years of monitoring tagged fawns, but you'll see that the whitetails shown in the open bars are much less likely to survive summer, and the mule deer are much less likely to survive the winter. So, whoops, goes too quickly. So you have this difference in season, but how does this affect their annual survival? And I'm using this as an example that will lead into work with other species other than deer. So I'll cover a couple basic topics. As most of you probably know, coyotes have very flexible diets. We have example here on the slide of a coyote hunting, an individual coyote hunting a ground squirrel, and at upper right, a coyote pack hunting deer. This flexible diet is related to this flexible social behavior. We have the pack at upper right, we have the individual hunting the ground squirrel at the bottom. And this flexibility also means that they can really move sideways when one food source is not available. They can easily shift to another food source. And the result of this is they're able to live at very high density. They're able to really mine a lot of food out of a given area. So with the demise of larger predators in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, by larger ones, I'm talking about wolves and bears that used to be on the prairie, coyotes really expanded their range across North America. And this flexibility in diet can enable them to live at high densities. So where usually people don't think of coyotes having a real big ecological impact, I think the combination of their flexible diet and the high density really makes them have a very large impact. For example, we could have, say, 2.5 coyotes per square kilometer plus pups at the McIntyre, and I've seen that this at other areas. For a wolf to be at high density, they usually come in at about 0.1 wolf per square kilometer. So radically different in terms of their numbers. Another basic concept is that the availability of one prey or food species, of prey species or food item affects predation on another species. Now, with that previous slide, if I had said, well, whitetails are more likely to be killed in summer and mule deer in winter, who's more vulnerable overall for the year? the right answer would have been, well, I don't have enough information because you didn't know what else they might be eating. So what we see at the McIntyre, and you're going to see the similar results for the Val-Marie area, is that as long as squirrels, and squirrels includes the ground squirrel shown here, which many people call gophers, or it includes prairie dogs, as long as they're abundant during summer, that tends to be the main food coyotes will capture during summer. So here we see data from the McIntyre Ranch, sort of when I first came there, and we see that from spring to fall, the coyotes, there was 82%, this is on average per month, 82% of scats had ground squirrels in them. And not so much deer in the, I'll say summer, spring to fall. But by winter, ground squirrels and prairie dogs, of course, are hibernating. So at that time of year, the coyotes shift to deer. But some populations change over time, and the population of ground squirrels had started to decline by about 2000. It really bottomed out by about 2004. And at that time, you see that there is now a big increase in the number of deer being used during the summer. They're being used during the summer, and they were also using them during winter. I'm going to feature some cattle. We had, just having troubles with my slide progression. There we go. So on average in 1994 to 96, there was about 6 to 7% of scat with cattle in it. Certain months were higher, such as May, we were up to about 29%. But you notice that in the more recent year, 2000, 2001, it was a bit higher. So throughout winter, it was around 25%. I didn't really think much of this at the time. In fact, I only went back and summarized this for 2000, 2001, because I didn't realize, as you'll see with Grasslands, this is a little cat visitor. Whoops. Didn't mean to be so hard on her. Yeah, I didn't think so much of these numbers. They seem like, oh, just a little window in time. All right, so bringing this back to the deer, how do seasonal changes in hunt activity affect annual predation rates? When there's lots of ground squirrels during summer, the coyotes are mostly hunting during the winter time, and that disadvantages the mule deer because they're more vulnerable at that time of year. But at times when ground squirrels have declined, the coyotes are picking up some other foods. For example, it could be carrion from cattle, it could be other food sources, and they hunt more in the summer. And those are the years where we found poor annual survival for whitetails. So we found this over time. So far I've been talking about how prey affects prey sort of for short time, like within one season or within 1 year. And you see how prey can buffer predation, like ground squirrels can buffer predation on deer during summer, but they also may end up increasing predation sort of during the winter if there's a big population that suddenly hibernates. So this had led me to start to wonder about the longer term effects. Do large populations of ground squirrels support large populations of coyotes and increase the overall predation on deer? So we've been monitoring coyote abundance since 1994, but ground squirrel populations we started monitoring around 2002 after I started wondering about this question. And this graph shows the ground squirrel population over time. It's unfortunate we didn't have it back in 1994 because I'm sure they were at least as high as they were more recently. And here we add the coyotes, and you can probably see there seems to be a correlation between these two. between these. And indeed, the correlation comes out as a very strong relationship. Like whether, so we can show these are correlated. We can't say that there are, that the ground squirrels are causing the coyotes to increase or decrease. That's possible, but we can't say that for sure. So far, we have not found a relationship between the abundance of the coyotes and the ground squirrels and the abundance of deer. But where I want to go from this is that around the mid 2000s, I first started to visit Grasslands National Park. Had a collaborator, John Wilmhurst, so we discussed these ideas. And I've been wondering if some similar things might be going on there. Could the prairie dogs or ground squirrels in that area affect coyote populations, which might lead to predation on other prey? For example, in the boreal forest, some of you might be aware of a situation with wolves or coyotes and who tend to be regulated. Their populations are regulated by the number of white-tailed deer and moose. So when there's a lot of white-tailed deer or moose, there gets to be lots of coyotes or wolves, depending on the area. And then caribou are really disadvantaged. They tend to be very vulnerable. So when you get one prey species supporting another, supporting the predators tend to pick off the caribou, and it can really drive their populations down. So I was wondering if you might end up with a situation like this in southwest Saskatchewan, where something like prairie dogs or ground squirrels could support coyote populations, and that could potentially put pressure on a species such as a sage grouse that's still active in that area during winter. So we started some work, it was very simple pilot work where we were collecting coyote scat in the West Block and then the ranch land, which at that time was outside the park boundaries. Here you can see a map of it from with all the scats we collected. We walked the main trails, drive the main trails, but we'd also walk around the prairie dog towns. And initially we found pretty similar results to the McIntyre. You see a lot of squirrels, including prairie dog or Richardsons, from spring to fall, and a lot of deer during winter. The numbers in parentheses were unidentified ungulates, so that's most of that would be deer. We found a very small proportion of pronghorn, about 1 or 2% at any time of year, very small in this area. Another item we found was the cattle, which across the year was about 10.5%, but this varied a lot seasonally. When you look at what we found from different seasons, you'll see it varied from, say, 13 to 32%. And Caitlin, if I use my mouse here, am I lining up with the, okay, because we have the two monitors, I wasn't sure.
Yeah, we can see your mouse there.
On this one, okay, sorry, I was using it on the other monitor, which you probably wasn't working. So within the shaded area, you'll see that spring was really the time where you get the highest values of cattle in the scat. And in summer, it was at its lowest. But between spring, fall, winter, and spring, it's, relatively high. These values, though, just the sheer percentage in the scat doesn't really give a good idea how much they're actually eating, because we did this by analyzing the morphological remains. Tim Showalter did this work. He's amazing with identifying, like taking bits and a few bones and identifying a species. And we find that small animals like voles and squirrels are overrepresented in scat because they basically have a lot of skin and fur and bones and teeth relative to the meat. And those are the parts that we can use to identify the species. the large animals have a lot of meat relative to these remains, so they're underrepresented in scat. So I was able to get data on sort of body weight at different ages and mortality from people like Ralph Thrall and Lynn Grant and some other sources, and was able to calculate the estimated biomass that was in the scat. And this gives a more real, it's an estimate, but it gives you a more realistic idea of how much food is in that scat of each type. And here you'll see that cattle came in at about, say, 30 to 40%, and then followed by deer. So that's really the dominant foods of these animals, of the coyotes in that area. So when we wrote up the paper presenting this earlier work, Shayla Jackson contacted me about doing a master's. So she was really interested in following up on this work. And we wanted to find out whether coyotes were still consuming much coyote and whether the consumption of cattle depends on maybe how close they were to livestock carcasses. To give a bit of context, other people's work in other areas show that carcasses can attract coyotes from 10 to 25 kilometers, and that the sort of carrion or other human-associated foods can increase coyote populations. So she also collected scat, and Ali Gallon collected most of the scat. I'm sure many of you know her. She's in Val-Marie, and collected most of the scat. It was over 800. This time we sent them off for molecular analysis to identify the species, or at least the genus, rather than the morphological approach. And we'll show some results showing a bit of the spatial distribution. Shayla analyzed how some spatial characteristics affected the contents. So at this time, the darker green shows the routes that she used. So she spent more time outside the park than I did in the earlier work. And these X's show the homesteads, which is relevant because we did examine how close certain foods were to homesteads. And the homesteads were a bit of a proxy for bone pits or boneyards. For ranchers who were involved, we do have the location of their bone pits, and then we ended up including data on the homesteads for the rest of the area. So this is what she found for the more recent work, 2021 to 22. You'll see that this is all winter food. And we see that deer and cattle come in at 48 and 18%, so the top two items. Okay, this graph might look a little busy, but sort of a simple point is that if you look at the x-axis, it shows the distance to a homestead, or in many cases, this is to a bone pit. And this is showing that as you get closer to the homesteads during winter, there was a higher probability of having cattle in a scat. We also found that as you got closer to the bison enclosure in the park, there was a higher probability, and that's illustrated by, say, the pink line is scats that's within a kilometer of the park, as opposed to the green line at the bottom are the scats that are over 12 kilometers away. I think this was only because there's a strong correlation between homesteads that tend to be closer to the west end of the West Block and to Val-Marie. I don't think it's in the bison enclosure itself. We did not find much cattle scat this time. Okay. In contrast to cattle, scat containing deer was further from homesteads and the bison enclosure. And when she began this work, we had hoped to identify individual variation in diet. That was really our focus, are some coyotes focusing on native prey and others on cattle. But unfortunately, the genetic, we were able to find out species, but we did not successfully find out the individuals. So this is just showing the map of the scats that Ali and Shayla collected. And the black ones are deer, and the red ones are cattle, had cattle inside of them. Of course, coyotes eat many other things. I'm limiting it to these sort of the top two ranked items for now. All right, so to summarize this part, Shayla found that, well, actually, this is combining data combined from the McIntyre Ranch in Saskatchewan, so not only based on the more recent work. So we're seeing both at the McIntyre Ranch and in the Val-Marie area that coyotes will generally consume the highest levels of deer when ground squirrels or prairie dogs hibernate. I should add that for Val-Marie, within the sort of bison area, prairie dogs was the dominant form of squirrel being consumed. And outside of that area, it was the Richardson's ground squirrel. And there was a lot more of the squirrel family, both ground squirrels and prairie dogs, consumed within the bison enclosure than outside of there. But we also see that, like as shown by the more recent work, so that's 2000, 2001 at the McIntyre, when squirrels are less abundant from spring to fall, the coyotes appear to rely more heavily on other foods such as deer and cattle carrion. Like at both locations, we're seeing these kind of occasional pulses of use of cattle. A couple summaries having to do more with the cattle angle. The cattle was relatively common in coyote scat from fall to spring. So it showed up in about 20 to 33% of the scat, but this is a larger proportion of the biomass. And until estimating biomass, it hadn't really dawned on me that this is a lot of food. Until then, I sort of thought it was pretty trivial. Shayla's work shows that for the winter scat with cattle, was clustered close to the homesteads or boneyards. These can be, as shown by other studies, and as I briefly mentioned, carcasses can really attract coyotes from a long way when they're available. So our data suggests that livestock carrion may serve as a bit of a subsidy for coyotes, especially at times of year such as winter when other food is limited, or in years when certain prey items such as squirrels are lower in numbers. Generally, for predators, their absolute population is really regulated by winter foods because that's the most limiting time of year. So I want to turn to look at Shayla's observational work. And here we're looking at the questions of why are coyotes occupying cattle pastures during spring? This is the time she did the work, from mid-May to mid-August. Are they going there to hunt calves as they're born? Are they going to scavenge cattle byproducts, such as afterbirth or carcasses? Or are they going for other reasons, such as to obtain native prey? In this work, she spent a few months there. I think she had made some fantastic findings, and I think it shows that longer term work, employing some of the same methods, but also incorporating some others, could be extremely productive. Being a master's student, she did the field work over the course of 1 year. So observation methods. Shayla and a research assistant, Megan Miller, observed coyotes on cattle pastures. And this is outside of the park. This is largely on the Grasslands and Greg Cornfeld's land. And they looked at the coyote's activity and the prey and food species. So when we conduct observations, basically every minute we record what's happening. If there's an interaction with prey, you're doing it more rapidly than that. She monitored distance between coyotes and cattle when cattle were in the field, and also whether or not coyotes would chase cows would chase coyotes, like whether they would defend a calf if it was approached. So this graph is showing a variety of different hunting or eating activities on the bottom, and the percentage of focal observations that she observed the coyotes interact with one particular prey. And so scavenge cattle, that's more of a food than a prey. And you'll see at far left that the most common activity was to hunt the ground squirrels, hunt Richardson's ground squirrels. And that was more common than hunting native ungulates. And hunting ground squirrels was also more common than either just interacting with cattle. For example, if a coyote tried to get the afterbirth from a female, or scavenging cattle. But she did observe some interest in cattle. She observed them, coyotes approach, an individual approach a calf 2 times, observed a few coyotes, I think it was about 2, rushing a cow-calf herd. And yes, the females did show defensive behavior. They would either chase the coyote if it was an individual, or they would bunch close together if a coyote rushed them. And she did observe one case in which they harassed a cow for access to afterbirth. Now, with the relatively short duration, meaning a few months, I wouldn't expect her to see a lot of these observations. But I have to say, I've been watching for about 8 years, and I think it was the summer of all those years. And I was out watching coyotes hunt deer at the McIntyre Ranch, and the deer were having their fawns in fields where the cows were having their calves. And I never observed coyotes approach. I've observed occasional coyote, I think, to get an afterbirth, but I've never observed this type of rushing behavior or approaching a calf. I just saw them walk right by newborns and go on their way without really looking. There was only one case where all the herd had been moved. One 6-week-old calf had been left in an area. The coyotes went right up to it. The calf stared at the coyote and they went on. So this is sort of unusual to even see this many attempts, or it seems unusual to me to see this many attempts over a fairly short time. So she found that coyotes were spending a lot of time close to the cattle. In fact, on this graph, you'll see that the dark lines, the dark bars, indicate times when they're within 10 meters of cattle, the lighter green within 100 meters, and the yellow is over 100 meters. And we saw this both in the morning, which is shown here, and in the afternoon. The little bit of data she has for after sunset suggests at that time that they might be moving away. So one reason might be that they're coming closer because there's a lot of ground squirrels, and potentially they could have more success when they're close to cattle. They could potentially use them as a bit of a blind. So this chart was to look at data to see whether coyotes are more successful hunting ground squirrels when they're close to cattle. And the blue shows whether or not they're stalking the ground squirrel. The orange is a chase, and the black is a capture. And now the graph makes it look as though they're more successful when they're close to cattle, within 100 meters, than when they're farther away. But we did not find a statistical difference. So I'd say, given the graph, a larger sample would be useful to confirm the outcome one way or the other. So the last thing I want to show before concluding is a video that Shayla assembled. She saw a lot of coyote aggression. This is different than the other topics have been presented today, but again, this seems so unusual and very inconsistent with what I've seen with coyotes at the McIntyre Ranch. At the McIntyre, I really have to scratch my brain and dig into notes to find maybe 3 or 4 cases where you had a bit of a dominance display that was lasting more like a few seconds or just in place. And she observed about 21 bouts occurrences, and some of the times they went on and on. So I'll play this video. Yeah, I've never seen anything like that at the McIntyre. So to summarize her results, the coyotes were mostly hunting native prey, the ground squirrels, when they occupied cattle pastures. At the same time, they seem to benefit from periodic presence of livestock carcasses. So we can't say, they might be going to these areas because there is the opportunity, something might become available. Whether or not the carrion, I'll talk a little bit more about depredation when I wrap up, I think. I'll leave that now. But at least anecdotally, I would say there's important differences in coyote behavior between these locations, between the McIntyre Ranch and between Southwest Saskatchewan. McIntyre Ranch, to my knowledge, doesn't really seem to have occurrences of depredation. I can't say that it never occurred. That seems unlikely, but at the Val Marie area, it seems to be more common. There seem to be credible reports. So to wrap up, I just want to focus on our role as ecologists is really to work with ranchers to try to develop best practices to benefit both conservation and ranching. So the relatively high amount of cattle that we find in the coyote's diet suggests that this is ecologically important. So based on this, I think it is important in order to understand the ecological community on Canada's grasslands, we need to consider the coyote's interaction with cattle carrion, as well as with native prey. As ecologists, we tend to just focus on the predators' interactions with native prey, oblivious to this other kind of food source, carrion, that's very common across the grasslands. And from ecology point of view, ecological, it's important because it has the potential to maintain or increase predator populations. Our work is short-term in serving as far as cattle goes. So I can't say that is happening, but it definitely has the potential. And that can also lead to problems for ranchers, such as depredation. It may be worth trying to discuss the possibility of carcass management strategies. Obviously, they have to be, if such strategies are adopted, this really has to be something with ranchers involved in their design to make this practical. Carcass management, because coyotes, people think they can take care of them in different ways. Carcass management strategies may be viewed as more important once, if or when larger predators come to the area. At the McIntyre, we now have grizzly bears. You will see them once in a while. This photo is not what it seems. This poor grizzly bear was sort of digging around, probably for ground squirrels, and the cows were putting the run on it. They've arrived around the mid-2000s is when the bears sort of first showed up in that area. So looking ahead, we really need to do some longer term work looking at how native prey and livestock carrion affect coyote populations, and in turn, other prey and cattle themselves. So we'd like to see work done, and if someone's interested in this type of the work, I would definitely be interested in some collaboration where we can really follow individual coyotes to link their movement, diet, and behavior across the grasslands over time. And as part of that, we'd really have to look at the availability of livestock carrion as well as native prey to find out, look at the availability of carrion and native prey. And a really specific and important outcome of this is to identify habitat and ranching conditions that may lead to depredation, where and when it occurs, where and when it doesn't occur, because that information can help us prevent it. So I'd like to conclude by saying that I appreciate that we would not be having these conversations if it wasn't for the ranchers who were really cared about their land and their cattle and want to see it have a future. So thank you.
The fabulous presentations. And as you can imagine, with questions already. um, so I guess I'll just kind of throw them at you rapid fire and we'll see how many we can work through if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah.
So an attendee named Ryan is wondering, are there peak times of day when coyotes tend to actively hunt or scavenge?
I can say about hunting, and I can't say about scavenging, but that's an excellent question. It depends on the species they're hunting. In the winter, to my surprise, and it took a long time for me to realize this, they hunt deer around midday most commonly. I would always go out early in the morning, late in the day. I'd hear them howl at 11 o'clock in the morning. I'd be, oh yeah, they're all done. But in fact, they were just grouping up. And then I'd look back at my observations. In summer, it's more, they'll do that early and late. And if there's a lot of ground squirrels, they go out after the ground squirrels emerge. So the ground squirrels tend to get active about an hour after sunrise. And so they'll really coordinate their hunting schedules with when the ground squirrels are above ground. So yeah, they do, because they're hunting deer sort of crepuscular early in the day and late in the day in summer, that's when they form packs, right? So I would expect that if there was going to be depredation, it would be at the same times, because that's kind of when they're doing the pack hunting, but I don't have data on that. Scavenging, I assume, yeah, that's a good question about scavenging.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for that answer. Melanie is wondering if you've considered roadkill for deer contribution to their diet. It would also seem that stillborn calves could skew the numbers as well. Do you have any comments about that?
Let's see. Oh, you mean in terms of the results from the scat? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, at the McIntyre, we had, well, okay, I guess you're thinking with Grasslands. We have, at the McIntyre, the vast majority of the deer that die is from predation by the coyote, sorry. And so what we've seen at Grasslands in terms of, say, the deer showing up a lot at winter is consistent with that. But I can't, say for sure where the deer came from at Grasslands the way I can say at the McIntyre.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Shirley's wondering, or she mentions in your early slide that was showing mule deer and white-tailed deer fawn survival by season, it was implied that coyotes were the cause of the fawn mortality. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. With our tagged fawns, it was almost all. We had one roadkill, two related to health, and pretty much all the others were that. Like we tracked them, and we also were out watching coyotes. So we did see our observations of coyotes hunting and killing fawns coincided with the death of these fawns. So we were able to verify it at the McIntyre.
Okay, Thank you. And we have a comment from Christina. And if this is the Christina I'm thinking, I believe she was living down like in the heart of Grasslands National Park. If you're familiar with the backcountry loop there. And she says, Susan, she's observed that coyotes rush cattle quite often, and using the power of the pack, any multiples of coyotes harass cattle. And it sounds like your observations were more coyotes passing by cows and calves. And she's seen coyote aggression that you showed in the video quite often, especially during the breeding season or during food shortages. Do you have any comments?
Yeah, I think that's fascinating because, yeah, Shayla, the one night I spent, I visited Shayla for sort of a week when she started, and the first night there was a group that rushed, and I was like, whoa, I've never seen this at the McIntyre. So, yeah, I would think there's a real behavioral difference. Like what she's saying is consistent with what Shayla saw. And I'd be really interested in finding out why there's this apparent difference. Because that might also relate to other issues that might be going on, whether it's depredation, and you were describing coyote human dog interactions. Yeah, things
Mhm.
that you wouldn't expect to see in a rural area.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so do you have any guesses on what the difference would be with kind of more aggression in Saskatchewan versus in Alberta?
Well, yeah, and it's probably not province wide the differences, but
Mhm.
anyway, for our
Yeah,
sites,
between like yeah, the McIntyre
yeah,
Ranch and Grasslands
mm,
National Park there.
yeah. When it comes to at the McIntyre, the coyotes aren't, they're not controlled in any way. And when people have, um, sometimes when there's lethal control, it can kind of backfire because other coyotes come in quickly. So it's possible that you're getting more of the transient coyotes as opposed to packs, though packs can, um, yeah, I don't know if they've gotten, you know how they often say if an animal gets a taste for beef kind of thing. I don't know how much truth that is, but I just wonder if there has been um, more concentration of carcasses. Like the McIntyre, it has sort of a luxury of being this big space. There certainly is a pit somewhere. There's certainly animals that die in the land, but perhaps you don't have as many homesteads, many of which have bone pits. So it could be a resource that coyotes that has prompted more aggression. But yeah, I would be interested in following up and finding out why this difference occurs has
Absolutely.
happened.
Yeah. And Catherine's wondering, is it basically true that coyotes can take down or kill a calf, but that they wouldn't prey on live adult cattle? Do you think that's true?
Yeah, I would be surprised if they would try for an adult cattle and um even like the only time I saw the coyotes go up to a calf, but this was at the McIntyre and it was maybe 5 or 6 weeks old and the coyotes had just failed on a deer attempt, so they looked very frustrated, to be honest. They were almost like a cartoon thing where we want to get something. But yeah, the calf just stood there looking them in the eye and they didn't proceed. But um, I do know someone at Val Marie area who suggests that they may have had older calves that were taken down. So I can't
Hmm.
follow up on that, but I would.
Yeah.
But when I started, people didn't think they took down deer, and we know they can take down deer and elk. At
Mhm.
our site, it's really the fawns of the year, but adults, it's still possible. They occasionally take down adults.
Interesting. And have you seen any evidence of bison or domestic cats
Oh,
in coyote scat?
okay, was the second one domestic cats, did you say?
Yes,
Oh, okay,
domestic
good.
cats,
Yeah, we
farm cats.
haven't seen bison. That was, yeah, I skipped over that when I first went. It was just after the bison reintroduction. So I thought, well, that could be another windfall, right? If you have a carcass out there, like that's going to elevate the coyote population and cause problems for other species at risk. But we haven't, I think we really didn't get any. We got one that registered as a bison, but that's one scat out of all of them. that Shayla
Mhm.
had, but it also didn't pass the quality control standard. Like these have to go through a process. So very slight, if at all. It was surprising there wasn't more.
Mhm. Yeah,
Oh, no,
interesting.
we haven't found any cats in any of the work we've done.
Huh. Okay.
Yeah, yeah,
So that's good to know.
yeah.
Um,
Good.
any evidence of like small dogs or chickens?
No, haven't found anything like that. We do find sharp tails. Not a lot of birds, about 5%, I'd say, in both the older study and the more recent. And they were all ground nesting birds, which makes sense that the coyotes would go after more ground nesting birds and not something in a tree. Um, so just one pheasant. I know someone thought that might be a big food item, but the potential of grouse, we did not find any sage grouse, but we did find the sharp tail, so there's potential there.
Okay. And have you seen any evidence of coyote predation on other predators such as red fox or swift fox?
Have not. And oddly, we didn't get any. We were actually trying to collect predator scat. And a surprise was out of all the scats, actually only, let's see, I guess about 500 scats came back with a predator ID. And two of those were badger. Like we would have expected a lot more. The rest came
Yeah.
back as coyote. So,
Okay.
but that was the predator who had eaten the prey kind of thing. But we didn't find coyote evidence of them consuming other predators. Oh yeah, I was just surprised that we didn't come. None of the scats came back as even being from a fox, which was very surprising because you do have foxes there.
Yes. Interesting. And Esther's wondering if you have any information on if their diet changes with coyote age or, yeah, any evidence of that?
Um, I would think it would only change really from the pup stage, like when they're first learning to hunt, the parents will take them out hunting like grasshoppers. And I didn't go into the small prey that are very common in the scat in the summer time. It's just fantastic berries and grasshoppers and a variety of things. But when they go on deer hunts, really I think the packs are probably the parents followed by the young of the year, but by winter, at the distances I observe at the ranch, it's really hard to tell what age they are. But it's really only the lead one or two who would make the attempt on the deer. The rest seem to be kind of along for the ride, which is why I kind of think they were the pups of the year. But at the same time, they will be eating the same food. Like they'll all go in once it's dead to eat. So yeah,
Yeah.
interesting question, but yeah, I can't say more, speak to that.
And do you know of an active removal program for either coyotes or ground squirrels at either of these locations?
Definitely. Oh, for coyotes or ground squirrels. Not
Yeah.
at the McIntyre. They try not to sort of intervene with really any of the wildlife. Um, I mean, I guess around Val-Marie, it's probably more up to, oh, I don't think there's a removal program, but
Mhm.
probably up to individuals. And we did notice less squirrels in overall in the scat for the ranching areas as opposed to the bison enclosure. So, in some ways, having more squirrels might take the pressure off other prey. It's hard to the prey interactions are very complicated. Like I look at the short term within a season, within a year, but once you're trying to see what's happening over multiple years, I'm not going to make claims for if a squirrel is benefiting um, or hurting sort of use a predation on cattle or deer, for example. That really needs some work. But okay,
Do,
the removal, yeah, I guess you can speak to that more. But one comment is lethal control for coyotes, because some people figure, well, we can solve the problem by shooting, but that seems to backfire. It seems to kind of work, it cause more problems. And um, other than removing carcasses, livestock guarding dogs seem to be the most effective, pretty much regardless of what the predator is.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. We had lots of questions come in about that and your thoughts on trapping coyotes and if it's beneficial or not. And yeah, so you said
I
it
think
would
the
backfire.
one, yeah, unless you know that there's a particular individual involved, I guess that's a different thing. But if you don't know that you have the right individual, you're more going to create a hole for another coyote to move in.
Yeah. Well, this is kind of all the time that we have today, and I feel bad we've got like more than 20 questions left or different comments and stuff, but people have been writing in to say how interesting the presentation is. Um, Pat Fargy from Grasslands National Park,
Oh,
or formerly Grasslands National Park, wrote in to say, great to get an update on your work, always very impressive. So lots of people have written in to say how fascinating the presentation is. And I just really want to thank you for sharing all of this amazing research with us today. And I think there's lots of things for us to think about and lots of lessons learned from your work. So thank you. This was a great presentation.
thanks, Caitlin. And if anyone does want to reach out, I guess I don't have my email on here, but you shouldn't have any trouble finding it.
Yeah, I think anyone can just Google you. So to all of our attendees, thank you so much for catching today's webinar. We had an amazing turnout. I think it was a record high. I know that I said this last
Oh,
time, but
good.
I actually like it just keeps getting higher and higher. So it's fabulous. It's great that we have so many people that are interested. I have been recording today's webinar. So if you want to listen to it again, if you missed something or want to share it with other people, it'll be on our YouTube channel probably tomorrow at noon. Um, and I also want to mention that we have an upcoming webinar about pronghorn, which is going to be awesome. So be sure to register for that, and that's at the end of March. Um, and when you leave today's webinar, there'll be a quick 1-minute survey. So as always, if you don't mind filling that out, we really appreciate getting feedback about what people want to hear for the future. So with that, thank you so much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day. Bye now.